This is a sobering day in our country because today the funeral service for George Floyd was held. I want to share some thoughts with you about our circumstances and our times, but I think it's first important to lay out the reality of our situation. George Floyd is a black man that was killed while being detained by law enforcement officers on Memorial Day in Minneapolis. And from the broken hearts and the pain and the wounds that were felt from this tragedy ensued demonstrations across our country, many of which were peaceful, some of which became violent and destructive. The strong response to George Floyd's circumstance wasn't just because of what he went through, as awful as that was, but his experience wasn't isolated. It didn't happen in a vacuum. But it was emblematic of a greater reality that the African American community is feeling. In 2019, the statistics show that African Americans were 2.5 times more likely to be killed after interaction with law enforcement officers than white Americans. But even this statistic isn't an isolated one. It's not found in a vacuum, but can be traced to the greater realities of our country going through the annals of our nation's history, back to an original sin of the institution of slavery that we have in our nation. Before our country was founded, when Africans were brought over and were used and abused as slaves, through the founding of our country, into the times of the Civil War. And then even beyond the Civil War, the oppression and abuse didn't end, but through laws of segregation, African Americans were continued to be held down. And those effects and those experiences are felt into today in a way that is undeniable and pervasive. I'm not an historian and I'm not a sociologist, but I think three areas of our community and of our life as a society that we can all probably agree that are important are the areas of economics, the areas of education, and the areas of justice. And let me just share with you these simple statistics that are easy to look up. In the area of economics, the average Black American household makes 59 cents to the dollar of the average white American household. In the area of education, the average Black American high school student that takes the SAT scores 100 points lower in the math portion than white American students. In the area of justice, this statistic is astounding, but out of the African American males born in the year 2001, the statistics say that 1 out of every 3 of them could expect to experience prison at some point in their lives, versus 1 out of every 17 white male Americans. Even further, in the year 2010, it was found that marijuana usage across races was comparable, yet African Americans were 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white Americans. This shows that the disparities are pervasive and undeniable. And it's heartbreaking and it's messy, to the extent that our community servants, our law enforcement officers, have been felt unappreciated and even attacked because this disparity has not even been spared from our justice system. Our servants, who are law enforcement officers, if you know them like the ones I know, they are servant-hearted. They are humble. They want the best for their communities. And yet, they've been swept up in all of this because the disparity has hit their ranks as well. So as Christians, the question is, how does God speak into this reality of our situation that's undeniable, that's pervasive? What does God have to say into it? And so we go to his word, where we hear his voice. And a great place to go for this circumstance is the book of Isaiah. And in chapter 1, here's what God says to his people. He says, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression. In other words, we are called, Christians are called, followers of Jesus are called to do something about this situation. If we fast forward into Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah, the prophet of God, speaks to this. God says, who shall I send? Who will go for us? And that's when Isaiah says his famous words. He raises his hand and says, here I am, send me. I will do something. But this is also where Isaiah exposes for us a couple mistakes that we can make as Christians in the situation that we currently find ourselves in. First, Isaiah says, here I am, send me. You know, if you're anything like me, sometimes when I want to do something about a situation, it's out of anger or frustration, or it's out of a knee-jerk reaction. You see, those are the things that are sending me to go and do something. But Isaiah's first move is to go to God in prayer. He says, here I am, send me, but he says that to God. God should be the one who sends us. Not our anger, not our frustration, not knee-jerk reactions. Isaiah shows us that the first reaction that we have is to go to God in prayer, so that he is the one who sends us to do something about the circumstance in our world. And even further than that, Isaiah shows us how we should approach God in prayer. In just a few verses earlier, as Isaiah finds himself in the presence of the Lord, what he says is this: woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live in the midst of a people of unclean lips. See, it's so easy for us to find the fault in others, to see the wrongs that others have committed, to judge others for their hearts and for their actions. But Isaiah, the prophet of God, first says, I am a man of unclean lips. Isaiah leads us, each one of us, to first explore our own hearts. He invites us to explore how we have contributed to the problems in our culture that we have found. He invites us to explore where we have been narrow-minded. He invites us to explore where we have overlooked the hardships of others, where we have failed to put ourselves in others' shoes and listen to their cries of pain. He invites us to explore how we have ignored those who need to be heard. See, that's the first move that God's people make when they go to him in prayer. Lord, show me where I have contributed to the problem and where I have failed to act, and change my heart. And when we do, Jesus comes with forgiveness, and he begins to change our hearts. And only then, when our hearts begin to change, are we able to look outside of ourselves and to invite others along into this journey of change that God desires for us to bring in our communities and in our world. But we first go to him in prayer. And yet this is where the second mistake can happen among God's people. Sometimes we can leave it at prayer. The place where we should start is certainly prayer, but we're not called to only pray. God says to learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression. We're not left to simply pray, but we should follow that with action, with doing something about it. Here I am, Isaiah says, send me. And what we're all called to do is different. You may be called to organize or to join a demonstration. You may be called to act by having a conversation with your family around the dinner table about these very sensitive issues. You may be called into running for office to bring about policy changes. You may be called to bring the people together that you work with and ask yourselves, how are we as a company or as an organization in our hiring practices and how we treat our customers? How are we doing? Do the employees that we have in our company, do the customers that we serve reflect those who live in our community? We may all be called in different ways, but one thing is for sure, we're all called to act and to do something about it. Because God is sending us to learn to do good, to seek justice, and to correct oppression. When we turn to Jesus, where we confess our contribution to the problems, Jesus comes mercifully with his forgiveness. And then he begins to work through us his justice and his righteousness in the way that he changes our hearts, in the way then we begin to act in our lives. And Jesus begins to bring healing into our land.